Hello, fellow rebel capitalists. I hope you are well. Monday morning here. We got a new mic setup. Let me know how the audio is in the live stream chat, if you will, please. I've just been saying test, test, test for like the last half hour trying to set this up. Okay, let's dive into a story that I think will open up a lot of your eyes. And before we do, I want to point out this book right there. It's blurry because of this new camera lens that we're using, but that is Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson. And one of the first things that he teaches us in that book is the fallacy of overlooking secondary consequences. He says this is something, and even back in his day, he saw the economists making this mistake over and over and over again. And then, of course, it's being repeated in the mainstream media and with the public. It was happening back then, and it's happening now to probably a greater degree, I would argue. And this article is just a fantastic example of this fallacy on many different levels. And then it also, I think, gives you an insight into the probabilities of inflation becoming an even bigger part of our future, even more so, believe it or not, than it has been throughout 2020 and 2021. But there's a lot of knock on consequences of what they're talking about in this article, which is universal basic income. They've rolled this out in Compton, California. I don't know if any of you have been to Compton. I hope not, because it's not a nice area, that's for sure. But the reasons why it's not a nice area, I think the opinion would differ dramatically from the people who are looking at that through the lens of just feelings, and then the people who are looking at that through the lens of critical thinking. So I'll explain exactly what I'm referring to, and we're going to reference one of my favorite economists, probably my favorite economist of all time, and that is Dr. Thomas Sowell, because he has gone into the data for the last few decades on why just giving people free money doesn't work. Let's dive into the article here. Let me do the screen share. Okay, inside the nation's largest guarantee income experiment. This is September 16th, 2021. I'm not sure what this website is, but it's basically referencing an article from Time Magazine. If you guys were watching last week, who just bought Time Magazine? That would be Benioff, Mark Benioff, the CEO of Salesforce. And why is that important? Why is that relevant? Because he is a disciple of one Klaus Schwab with the World Economic Forum. So when I talk about the global elite, the World Economic Forum and the IMF having this, we'll call it influence over CEOs, and I go back to Germany in the 1930s, or even more specifically, probably, or a better example, maybe Mussolini's type of fascism. And when I'm talking about the fascism, I'm talking about the economic component of it, where the government didn't really own the means of production. There were private companies, there was corporations, but you just had this corporatism, very similar to what we see today, where the government didn't own the entities, but they influenced them tremendously. So they might as well have owned them. And you see the exact same thing playing out with the global elite. They have so much influence over a lot of these corporations that are run by the useful idiots, by the puppets. And therefore, does the World Economic Forum really need to own Salesforce? Do they need to own all the drug companies? Do they need to own Facebook? Or no, not really. But as long as they have a certain degree of influence over them, the net result will be the same. And I think we see it playing out, and why you notice the tone of this Time article being so, we'll call it in favor of or shedding an optimistic light on UBI and this, we'll call it a project here in Compton, where they've basically given people up to $7,200 a year in addition to all of the other benefits that they may be receiving from the government. But let's get into it here. And you guys know from watching my videos, the first red flag is when you see an article start off with some random personal story to get you emotionally engaged. You know that the story is not about facts, it's not about data, it's not about the scientific process, it's not about scrutinizing a specific hypothesis rigorously. It's about propaganda. It's about trying to manipulate you to have a certain opinion, absence of critical thinking, and really prioritizing feelings. A fried chicken chain in Compton, California strip mall. They splurged on a few plates of fried rice, each costing under $13.99. The money, the money Leo, 39 years old, makes as a mechanic never seems to satisfy the dolge of bills that pile up on his kitchen counter each month. So the modest meal felt like a luxury. It made me very happy, Leo says in Spanish through an interpreter. Okay, so well, what you'll see as we go through this article is that Leo, and I'm sure he's a great guy, but he is most likely in the United States illegally. And but regardless, let's set that aside for a moment. If you're coming to the United States, or I've been to Colombia. You guys know I spend a lot of time there. And whenever someone goes down to Colombia, usually gringo or maybe someone from Europe or something like that, what's the very first thing they usually do? They learn Spanish, especially if you want a job in Medellin. If you're some sort of young person that's getting out of college, you want to experience the world, you're backpacking, but you want to work your way from country to country throughout South America, let's say, you're going to need to know how to speak Spanish if you want to make enough money to provide for yourself. So I understand that it's great that Leo has enough money to go to a fried chicken chain, but wouldn't it be a little more productive, maybe a better use of Leo's time to learn English? And I'm not saying that Spanish is bad or any other that English should be the dominant language in the world because it's superior. I'm not saying that at all. In fact, I've actually, as you guys know, I know quite a bit of Spanish myself, and probably not as much as I should. But I think Spanish is a better language than English. It's a lot easier, that's for sure. When you really start to study languages, you see the English language, and you're like, this English stuff makes no sense. There's no rhyme or reason to it whatsoever. Or Spanish, there's at least kind of a rhyme and reason to it. But I don't want to go down that path. But here's the first thing that kind of, number one, you see the red flag, knowing that it's propaganda because they start with this emotional story. But then number two is you start scratching your head and saying, okay, well, why doesn't Leo learn English? And maybe Leo could improve his lot in life a lot faster by knowing English or learning English than he could maybe by getting quote unquote free money from the government. And I don't know that there is any excuse to not learn English. I mean, you can go online and take English classes on YouTube for free. I'm guessing Leo has a cell phone, and he can go on YouTube just like any of us and watch those classes and learn English very quickly. I mean, you can learn basic English in probably 3 or 4 months if you really put your nose to the grindstone. But let's not incentivize Leo to learn English to better himself to where he can be more productive and therefore produce more goods and services, receiving more money to improve his lot in life. Let's just give him free money so he doesn't have to do anything. That's kind of the direction of this article, but it goes in many different directions. This is a very extensive, it's a huge blog post or online article here. I'd suggest reading it, but we're going to go through some of the main points. So, continuing on, the family was only able to afford the meal because Leo is part of a groundbreaking guaranteed income experiment in the city called the Compton Pledge. In regular installments between late 2020 and the end of 2022, Leo and 799 other individuals are receiving up to $7,200 annually to spend however they like. Leo, an undocumented immigrant from Guatemala. So I don't really study this stuff extensively, but last time I checked, I think undocumented immigrant means that he is here illegally. I don't know. Am I going out on a limb on that one, Josh? I think he's here, and I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I personally think that we should have zero welfare, and we could be a lot less strict at the borders because you would have a completely different incentive structure. So I'm not here to condemn Leo for being an undocumented immigrant. I'm just pointing out that hey, that could make things a little bit harder if you're here illegally, hence breaking the law, and also you don't speak English. So, is this really a good example for Time Magazine to use as to argue for UBI at a federal level? I don't think so. But of course, they're doing it anyway because it serves their narrative, Time Magazine, which serves the narrative of Benioff, which serves the narrative of the World Economic Forum and Klaus. Time has agreed to refer to him as a pseudonym to protect his identity. And I like how they go way out of their way to protect his identity. But yet, if someone comes out uh, and says that we should focus on, if a scientist, as an example, a virologist comes out and said that, hey, you know what, maybe we should, I don't know, maybe consider natural immunity when we're looking at all these passports and all of these mandates, the medicine mandates, we'll call them. And of course, then every one of these individuals on social media wants to not only dox this person, but they want them to lose their job. They want to get their full name out there as quickly as possible. If you guys watch my whiteboard video where I referenced this, well, I won't. I'll try to take the high road here, and I won't give the name of the YouTuber, but he was doing a story on this gentleman that was in the New York subway and refused to wear a mask. And it is true that the guy with the small clips that I saw was being rather obnoxious. He didn't have to do that, but does he really deserve to be doxxed? And all these TikTokers and social media influencers were trying to notify his work and get his name, his full name and address out there so the public, so he could pay the penalty for, you know, his malfeasance. And you know, he could make sure that he's out there saying and apologizing for all of his sins for valuing freedom and standing up for freedom, and granted a slightly obnoxious way, but still, does he really deserve that? And then they were going to the extent of, they meaning these social media influencers, were even calling his family. They somehow got his family's phone number and was calling his mother, his sister, and telling them that, you know, all of the bad things and the evilness that this gentleman perpetrated on the fellow individuals in this subway. And so again, I you got to see it for what it is, and it shows you that this narrative and this push is really for individuals who are, uh, you know, let's be honest, they're coming here illegally. And I'm not saying, well, I shouldn't say that's right or wrong. I shouldn't really say that I have a belief one way or the other, because I think the whole system is completely flawed. But you know, the guy's breaking the law and he doesn't speak English, and he's obviously doesn't seem like he's trying to learn English at all. And we're protecting him at all costs, but yet someone who is, you know, refusing to wear a mask on a subway. then we're making sure we completely crush their lives. It just goes to show you that there's a lot more to this than just UBI or safety. The organization running the Compton Pledge, called the Fund for Guaranteed Income, is building the technological infrastructure necessary to distribute cash payments on a broad scale, and has partnered with independent research group to study the extent to which minimum income floor can lift families like Lido out of poverty. Okay, well, as you guys know, this is headed straight toward a central bank digital currency. That's where this is going. It's going to universal basic income, meaning at a federal level, and it's going to be distributed in my opinion, and again, there's no certainties, only probabilities, but I think the probability is extremely high that this will be carried out by the Federal Reserve. And the main reason is because then we don't have to worry about the debt ceiling. I don't want to get into a whole whiteboard video right here, or the equivalent of a whiteboard video. But if the government, or excuse me, if the Federal Reserve is distributing this UBI by simply creating bank reserves out of thin air, just like they do for quantitative easing, that would not affect the balance sheet of the federal government. That money's not coming from, or those dollars, I should say, aren't coming from the federal government. So theoretically, they could spend. I think in this article they said that the cost for this in dollar terms would be about 3.5 trillion per year. Well, why not just have that as a part of the Fed's balance sheet? That's just a liability of the Fed. It doesn't have to be a liability of the government. And therefore, you go into this MMT mode where we just, as a society, they believe that they can just print free money. We've figured out how we could engineer a free lunch. We can just have the Federal Reserve print these bank reserves for the poor people, just like they've been doing it for all the rich people on Wall Street. It goes from QE for Wall Street to QE for Main Street. I think that's one way that they'll justify this. But unfortunately, there are no free lunches, and that will only lead to inflation, which will exacerbate the problem for people like Leo, because he obviously spends a disproportionate amount of his income on things like food, energy, housing, and the cost of those will skyrocket. Where the billionaires like Benioff and the billionaires like the gal who's actually running the fund for guarantee, or the Compton Pledge, which you'll find out later on in the article, their food costs are just a microscopic fraction of their overall income. So my point is they'll create inflation, which will end up hurting Leo in the long run. But let's continue. Can these cash infusions transcend their status as a small research project in progressive Los Angeles and someday work as a nationwide program funded by taxpayers? Yeah, so here's where they're transitioning into this biggest question, which I think takes us to the UBI at a federal level issued by the Federal Reserve. But going back to this last highlight here, I want to point out the minimum income floor can lift families like Leo's out of poverty. Now I want to go back to this book right here. It's Thomas Sowell's Basic Economics. And I can't recall whether he addresses this specifically in that book. I've read 4 or 5 of his books, so I kind of get them confused. But Dr. Sowell has pointed out many, many times, and he's done this in debates as well. If you go back to the YouTube debates that are awesome, by the way, going back to the 1970s and the 1980s, he points out that there have been 0 groups who have been pulled out of poverty as a result of welfare. Just try to think of one. Just go back throughout history. Go to any country. He studied it in areas like Malaysia, in areas like India, in the United States. All of these countries who instituted a welfare program, did any of them bring the group they were trying to help out of poverty over the long run? And the answer was unequivocally no, never. In fact, the only evidence that he saw suggested the complete opposite, where it actually kept them in poverty longer. So you see, we go back to the fallacy of overlooking secondary consequences, where Time Magazine and Benioff and this billionaire gal, which we'll introduce here in a moment, they're looking at this as, oh, this is great for Leo. Now he can afford to go to Church's Chicken. But what they fail to recognize are the knock on effects of giving people, quote unquote, free money. And that, yes, it may fix some things in the short term with some of the individuals, but over the long term, you will be hurting the group more than you will be helping the group. Let's continue on. Less restricted forms of cash assistance largely ended in the 1990s. By George Bush, you ask? No, actually, by President Bill Clinton's welfare reforms, as both Republicans and Democrats argued government benefits were de incentivizing work. It sounds pretty non controversial to say that, doesn't it? That if you give people free money, it will disincentivize work. But for some reason today, we've forgotten all of the things that just seemed like basic common sense in the 1980s, 1990s, even by the Democrats themselves, and even by the folk hero of the Democratic Party, Bill Clinton. But after a year and a half of the pandemic, okay, so now we're skipping to this. After a year and a half of the pandemic, 3 rounds of stimulus checks and a newly expanded child tax credit, proponents of the cash-based systems feel like the tide is turning. This is an inevitable future, argues Nika Soon Shiong. And I apologize, I'm probably mispronouncing that, Nika. But this is the gal that's in charge of this Compton project. She is the executive producer of the Fund for Guaranteed Income. Excuse me. So that might be a different project, but same worldview. Even if guaranteed income never catches on, economists and public officials may glean lessons from giving poor people financial breathing room from 2020's pandemic relief packages and Joe Biden's 3.5 trillion budget proposal, which includes a permanent expansion of the child tax credit. So we've talked about on this channel how it's bizarre that the lines at Louis Vuitton when you go to your local mall are 500 yards long, isn't it? And then you see the people in line and you're asking yourself that's weird. These aren't the typical people you'd see in line here. And it looks like a lower income demographic. And then you come to the conclusion that these child tax credits, which again, don't let the name fool you. They're not a tax credit. They're basically just an advance payment for what should be a tax credit, but it's a STEMI check. It's a STEMI check. And the more kids you have, the more money you get, the more dollars you get. And I can tell you from personal experience going in through some of these malls that maybe not 100%, but a significant portion of the child tax credit STEMI is not going to a child. It's going to Louis Vuitton. It's going to Gucci, and it's going to pay for trips to Las Vegas. I can almost assure you of that. And some more anecdotal evidence, which I'll give you. I was having dinner with a friend of mine for it was a birthday dinner, and there was someone sitting at the table who was a school administrator. Has been a school administrator here in Phoenix for at least 20 or 30 years. And she was telling me how during 2020, they wouldn't let the kids go to school, and they noticed that a lot of the students were not checking in online. So her being an incredible person, and as well as a school administrator, volunteered to go with some of the teachers to some of these families that were not checking in to figure out what's the problem here. And a lot of them, she said, did not have internet service, and therefore the kids weren't able to check in online. And you may say, well, George, that's an argument for this universal basic income. But what she also said is almost every single family that she went to that would not spend the money to give internet for their kids so they could log into school were more than happy to spend $5,000 on wheels for their SUV. She said time after time after time, the parents would have something expensive, whether it was tennis shoes, whether it was a purse, whether it was, a new car, new motorcycle, what have you. But yet they'd sit there and say that they don't have the money to buy internet for their kid. And therefore they want, some sort of assistance in order to pay for internet. It was the same thing when another individual at this table who works for a local law firm, they were doing a charity. I call it a promotion, but they were saying it was for charity, and basically they were giving backpacks full of school supplies. This was fast forward to, this was kind of when the kids started to go back to school after the lockdowns here in Arizona. They were, giving these backpacks out for kids and families who were, let's say, underprivileged, I think would be the politically correct term. And again, this person was expecting to give all of these backpacks because they had to physically deliver them, like 1,000 or 2,000 of these backpacks to the homes. So she is expecting to see them in dire straits financially, but she saw the exact same thing where they've got a brand new Louis Vuitton purse, they've got brand new Gucci shoes, they've got brand new rims or whatever on the SUV, but they're somehow saying that they don't have the money to buy their kid a backpack and some pencils or pens or notebook paper, something like that. And because they had to apply to get the free backpack in the first place, the law firm didn't just randomly select them, and they didn't deny anybody. Like the first 2,000 people that registered got the free backpack, and there were no strings attached. So you see, that's my point here, is that yes, Time Magazine and Benioff might be able to select a few individuals, but then once you peel back the layers of the onion, it brings up more questions as to why this person can't make ends meet in the first place. And are they really disadvantaged, or are they just making really, really, really bad decisions with their money? And more money won't fix that, by the way. If you're bad with money, more money won't make you good with money. So it goes on to say, and despite the proliferation of guaranteed income pilots, cementing them beyond experiments funded through charity is proving tremendously politically challenging amid fears that such policies keep low income Americans on the government dole. And I don't know how this is debatable. It goes back to the Charlie Munger quote: "You show me the incentives, and I will show you the outcomes." But they say that's not how Leo sees it. While he used a few bucks from the Compton pledge for fried rice dinner, the rest went to more pressing causes. A $250 car diagnostic tool enabling him to take on more mechanic jobs. Right, but you know what would really allow him to take on more mechanic jobs? Is if he spoke English. So is it really is his problem here that he doesn't have enough money for a diagnostic tool, or is there something else going on here? Is there something else that would move the needle? And then the question becomes, well, why hasn't he learned English? Then he could get a college textbook for his 23-year-old stepdaughter. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but okay, we've got a stepdaughter involved. So I don't know. Maybe Leo and his wife haven't made great decisions in their personal life either. Just throwing that out there. A few $100s sent to his ailing mother in Guatemala. Here's something else. That is it that Leo doesn't have enough money for fried rice and a car diagnostic tool, or is it that he's sending the majority of his income back to his family members in Guatemala? And listen, more power to him. I mean, good for you, Leo, for taking care of your family. And my hats off. You've got my respect. But let's not insinuate that Leo is just completely destitute, although he's working 80 hours a week and doing absolutely everything possible that he can to take care of his immediate family right here in the United States. He's doing everything possible, working 80 hours a week, but yet he still can't make ends meet. That's not really the whole story here. And then he's got a $3,000 payday loan that has accrued nearly $1,000 in interest in the last 2 years. Okay, so what? I don't want to go down that path, but again, I'll reference Thomas Sowell. Thomas Sowell has done extensive work on payday loans and what that does to a local economy in poor areas, and it actually benefits it. It doesn't help it because where else would Leo go as an undocumented quote unquote worker to get $3,000? And by the way, how many of those people pay back the 3 grand? So is the $1,000 of interest a result of these greedy capitalists, or is it a result of half the loans not being paid back? And then he's got some medical expenses as well, because of course Leo does not have health insurance because of his immigration status. I think said more honestly, Leo doesn't have health insurance because he is here illegally. So now they're saying I don't know why they call it there were no cockroaches. That's kind of weird, but so this gal, I can't remember her first name. I apologize. Soon Xiong, a doctoral candidate from the University of Oxford, initially planned to launch the fund for guaranteed income after completing her thesis on cash transfer systems in India. But after the pandemic, she realized that she needed to act fast in her local area in California. I'm sure most of you would be shocked that she is living in California. It really felt like there weren't enough people thinking about the solution. And I like how the solution is just give people free money. Like the solution can't be learn English. Uh, that is just you see the mental gymnastics required to really hold this position and the intellectual dishonesty that Miss Soon Xiong actually has. And I don't want to throw her under the bus here, but I mean, come on, let's call a spade a spade. She is the daughter of billionaire business tycoon and Los Angeles Times owner Patrick Soon Xiong, and tells time from her spacious West Hollywood apartment. And isn't this just totally typical? It's you have all of these kids of billionaires and billionaires themselves, and it's like they feel guilty that they've made that much money. And I mean, I can kind of sympathize with this gal because what has she done to have that spacious Hollywood apartment? What goods and services has she produced? Do you think honestly that she produces an equivalent amount of goods and services represented by the amount of money that she spends monthly? Not even close. And again, I don't want to say this definitively. I should not have said that. But I would be willing to bet quite a bit of money that Miss Soon Xiong spends or her purchasing power far exceeds the rate at which she produces goods and services efficiently. I think that's the best way to say it. So, of course, she feels guilty because she's just sitting at home or in Oxford, whatever, just pontificating on all of these things and spending, 50 grand a month coming in from dad or the LA Times. And I'm sure dad's got connections with Benioff and the World Economic Forum. and all of these other people. So sure, she'd feel guilty. And the only way to satisfy or to alleviate some of that guilt is just to give people money to make it seem as though there aren't as many poor people in the world as there were yesterday. And see, when you get to the bottom of these do-gooders, usually the at the core is not really helping people. It's making themselves feel good. That's really what it's all about. It's about making themselves feel better about the life they lead. It's not really about helping people, because if it was really about helping people, they'd be far more honest about the data. You see, but if they look at Thomas Sowell's study that says that welfare uh, affects people negatively, or large groups, over many decades, and I think that's evident here in the United States with the welfare programs that we have had since, call it, the 1960s, the 1970s, or maybe even going back to the 1930s in the Great Depression. But if you're Miss Soon Shiong, you can't accept the fact that welfare doesn't benefit people, because then there's nothing you can do to make yourself feel better about consuming far more than you produce. You see how that works? But if there's welfare, then she can battle for something that makes her feel better, even though it most likely doesn't move the needle at all. And if anything, is counterproductive. Moving on here. Unlike some forms of federal assistance, the Compton Pledge would be open to undocumented immigrants. Again, I could be wrong, because I haven't taken a deep dive on what that means, like I have with not really my passion, like economics is, or the freedom movement. But I think that's people who are here illegally and formerly incarcerated individuals. And so again, let's put incarcerated individuals into this group that just got bad breaks. That's the way these people try to make it seem, as though they're doing everything possible. They did all the right things, but somehow, at no fault of their own, they just wound up in prison for 10 years. How does that happen? See, they're taking individual responsibility completely out of the equation. And they're doing it with Leo, and they're trying to do it with people who are incarcerated. Now, it is true that some people get put in prison or whatever for a crime they didn't commit. I totally acknowledge that. And I think there's something that we need to do about that. And I think that many of the crimes that people are in prison for should not be crimes, i.e., drugs. I've always thought that drugs should be legalized in the United States, but that comes with a caveat. If you're going to legalize drugs, you can't defund the police. See, if you're going to legalize drugs, you've got to reduce the dependency on welfare. So it's not just a one size fits all type of approach, but philosophically, I have always been in favor of legalizing drugs, especially marijuana, which would dramatically reduce the nonviolent people who are actually in prison today. But let's not talk about that. Let's just try to make it seem as though, none of them have done anything wrong. And therefore, when they get out, we should be giving them as much free money as possible. Okay, then it goes on to say, and rather than make marginalized people who are wary of giving strangers their home address and financial information apply for the program. So again, are we really going to go to this extent where we're not only giving people free money, but we're just bending over backwards to where they don't even have to get off the couch? They don't even have to click the off button on the Oprah or whatever show they're watching during the day. We don't have to give their home address. I mean, come on now. It's just, again, it's this parental mentality that Miss Soon Xiong has, and so many people that are not only, well, most of them are in California, but seems to be on the coast. They just have this mentality that they have this maternal instinct. And again, I think it stems from them just being guilty that they consume so much more than they produce. And this makes them feel better, even if it doesn't move the needle or even if it's counterproductive. And so this is something that I also want to point out. The combination of all that leads to what we have here, which is an epidemic of poorly treated chronic disease. This is according to Dr. Elaine Batchelor, the CEO of MLK Community Healthcare, a hospital healthcare system in South Los Angeles. An estimated 40% of adults in the 100,000 person city, and I think they're referring to Compton, where they're doing this Compton Pledge Universal Basic Income program. 40% of the adults are considered obese. 12% of the adults have diabetes. And residents are significantly more likely to die due to lung cancer, cardiovascular disease, and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease compared to the surrounding county residents, according to data compiled by the LA County Department of Public Health. Okay, so why would you be obese? Let's just start there with something very basic. Would you be obese just because that kind of were born fat, or you just had some sort of genetic disposition to being 400 pounds, or you had some genetic predisposition to being 400 pounds? No. Sure, there are some people who are a little bit bigger, but that means that if you're 5'8", as an example, your average weight would go from, let's say, 155 to maybe 160. It doesn't go from 155 to 350 pounds. All right. You have to be doing something. It has to be your fault to a certain degree that you weigh 350 pounds or 400 pounds or 500 pounds. Uh, Diabetes, very presentable or preventable, excuse me. There's things that you can do, i.e., lose weight. Don't be fat. Eat healthy, eat well. Right. So, and again, we go back to Leo having enough money to buy fried rice. Okay, well, is it really an issue that these people don't have enough money to eat? Because if they don't have enough money to eat, why do they all weigh 400 pounds? Or why are 40% of them obese? Which, by the way, I almost guarantee you the measurement for obese here in the United States is dramatically different than what it would be elsewhere, in Europe or South America or several places. Pretty much every place I've been throughout the world. It's getting bad in Australia and Canada and the UK, but most of the other places I've been in the world, what would be considered obese there, here in the United States, would just be considered big boned or something like that. But the main thing I'm pointing out here, that again, it's they're creating their own, they're reaping what they sow to a certain degree. In that, they're not learning English. And then they're saying, oh, well, my gosh, we're just burdened by all of these medical bills, as they're just, scarfing down 18 bags of Cheetos and, 10 large pizzas and a bottle of Coca-Cola. And yeah, okay, but just like Leo being able to learn English, that is something that is within their control. So is it better to just give these people, quote unquote, free money so that they can go to the hospital nonstop because they weigh 400 pounds? Or would it be better to get them just to put down the pizza and not eat as much and maybe go for a walk, maybe exercise a little bit? It's the same thing here. 3 out of the 4 Compton Pledge families time interviewed over the first 6 months, they received checks. They received checks expressed they were battling some sort of chronic illness. Again, diabetes here, in Leo's family, asthma. Asthma, I realize probably not much you can do about it unless she's a smoker. But then with most of these chronic illnesses will be a result of just overeating and not exercising. So we're not treating the symptom, we're just treating the cause, or we're treating the result of the symptom. Or we're not treating the cause, we're treating the symptom. I think I said that backwards. Okay, guaranteed income advocates say wealth taxes, such as those advocated by the Democratic Senators Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, could make the math work, at least for a program that helps very low income people. And they argue that while it takes money to invest in larger social safety net, it's more expensive in the long run not to do this. Okay, there again, then why don't we just give everyone $1 million, and then we're gonna save so much money in the future. We'll be able to pay down the national deficit. We won't have any issues at all, right? It doesn't make any sense when you take it to its logical conclusion. Also, I would say that going back to what Thomas Sowell, he has proven that at no point in time, in no community, no ethnic group, no group within a society has welfare helped them or resulted in them getting out of poverty and moving up the ladder, the socioeconomic ladder, into the middle class and into the upper class. So why should we assume that this is the cure for all of our problems? People who can't afford to pay rent or their bills are likely to need other services from the government. From the government will end up paying for, like housing assistance. Poverty is strongly linked to incarceration, which costs taxpayers at least $80 billion a year. Okay, we discussed that, but let's also go back to people who can't afford to pay rent, need other services from the government. Okay, so let's do this. Let's just print a bunch of money and give it to people and ignore the fact that's going to increase the cost of rent and other bills for society at large, which again disproportionately affects the poor and middle class negatively. So you see this cycle that we get into, not just from a human standpoint, but an economic standpoint, where the more money you give people, the more inflation goes up, the fewer goods and services we have. And you see this positive feedback loop that just takes prices higher and higher and higher and makes the lot of the poor worse and worse and worse, which incentivizes the government and the politicians to give them more and more money, which makes inflation go higher and higher and higher. That's really this doom loop or this doom vortex that they will inevitably create because they didn't read Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt, and they are falling under or they are committing the fallacy of overlooking secondary consequences. And one thing I want to point out before we go any further, and is I don't know if all of you know this, and this is something I've mentioned a couple times on my channel, but I haven't really talked about it lately. But it's very relevant to this. And back in 2017-ish or so, I was in Tucson helping out my younger brother. I was spending most of my time in Medellin then, but I came up to help my younger brother. I was bored out of my mind, and that's when I started to get into these trucks and whatnot. But even before I did that, I wanted to do this project that I called Minimum Wage to Millionaire. And this tells you actually how crazy I am in my personal life. That I retired in 2012. I didn't need to work at all, but I just for whatever reason, because I'm psychotic or I'm a masochist, I don't know. I decided to prove a point, and I was going to document it, and I still have all the footage. Someday I'll probably release it. Who knows? But it was this project called Minimum Wage to Millionaire. So what I did is I started with like I think it was $1,000 in the bank and a low a car that was very inexpensive. It was a Prius, and then I set up my apartment for the first couple months, and it was just the cheapest apartment I could possibly find. It was in the ghetto of Tucson, and I think I was paying like $350 a month for this apartment, and it's just a little teeny weeny studio, and that's pretty much all I started with. And then I supported myself with my real money, until I actually got a job, and then that's kind of when that was the starting point, and I separated my bank accounts as well, so I could prove and I could see, what I was doing, the progress that I was making, and the objective was to start working a minimum wage job and just continue to do that until I made $1 million, and before I had until I had $1 million in the bank, and you'd think, "Oh, George, that's gonna take you forever. That's gonna take you a long time." Not really. What I was doing is I got a job, believe it or not, at McDonald's. And just to prove this, let's go to here's a picture. You can see, and this is not a picture of when I was, we'll try to zoom in. No, it's not zooming in. Okay, well, you guys can see it. And you can tell that this is not a picture of me when I was 16 years old. This is a picture of me in 2017 when I was working at McDonald's to really pursue this project and really prove a point to myself and to everyone else. And so, what I was doing is I was working 4 or 5 days a week at McDonald's, and I had a shift that I'd work something I can't really. It was like 4 o'clock to 11, something like that. And then when I wasn't working there, I would drive Uber. That's why I had the Prius, and I would save everything I had. And I would eat relatively well. I wasn't going out to eat. Of course, I was buying all my groceries, but I wasn't eating burgers. I was still eating healthy, just the way I always do. And then the objective was I was going to save enough money to start flipping trucks. And I was going to parlay that into something else and parlay that into something else. And then I had this game plan that if I did this, it was probably about 2, 3 years, I would have $1 million in the bank. And what happened was some issues with my brother. My brother got worse in certain ways, which prevented me from pursuing this. But I did it for like 6 months. I worked at McDonald's for 6 months. I mean, I can give you the address. You guys can go down there and check for yourself. I didn't tell them what I was doing, and they had no clue why I actually wanted to work there. And I remember my last day on the job, many of them, who I became friends with, my fellow coworkers, kind of cornered me and said, "Okay, George, tell us the real reason why you work here, or why you've been working here." And I didn't really share it with them, but I said, one day we'll come down. I'll take you guys out for a beer, and we'll all get a kick out of the story. And another funny component of that is the first thing they had me do was work the drive-through. So I'd take the orders and I'd collect the money, and every single person that changes, they give them a brand new uh, thing of money. I forgot what it was called, but that tray that you put in there that with the money on it, the change and whatnot. Every single person that where the shift would change, they'd give them a new tray. They'd count the money, and then when you came back, they'd see how close to it, uh, to being perfect that you were as far as giving people the correct change and whatnot. And I didn't know this, but no one ever has the correct amount of change when they're done with their shift. Like nobody. They're always at least like a nickel off or something like that, which is understandable. I mean, you're there taking orders for 6 or 7 hours or whatever. And I remember the first time that I came back and I gave my manager the tray, she went through and she counted everything up, and her jaw almost hit the ground. She said, "I cannot believe this. I've been a manager here for, whatever it was, 5, 10 years, something like that." She goes, "I have never in my life seen anyone come back where their tray was exactly perfect down to the penny." And she goes, "You're the first one." And I said, "Oh, okay. Well, that's good." So from that day forward, they had me working the drive-through every single night. It's a true story. But my point is, I was able to save up a bit of money, and then I was able to buy my first truck. I was able to flip that, and then I was able to flip a couple. And by the time I got done after 6 months, and I wanted to pursue it, but again, my priority was my family, and my brother needed more of my attention, so I wasn't able to pursue it. I probably had 20 or $30,000 in the bank from just starting off with $1,000, a Prius, and a job at McDonald's. So what's my point? It's that I really struggle when I see articles like this saying that it's just impossible for people to make ends meet in the United States, especially when we have job openings at all-time highs. 11 million job openings right now. We've got wages going up, a lot of wage pressure. The labor market is extremely tight, and therefore employees can demand more money. So listen, if I can do this back in 2017, um, you say, "Oh, well, George, you don't have a family. You didn't have this, Okay, well, isn't that a decision that people make? Isn't that a conscious decision? I mean, shouldn't we maybe wait to have kids until we can, I don't know, afford to have kids? I don't think that's some radical idea. But again, it's within the individual's control. I was doing what I needed to do. I was working 10, 12 hours a day just to prove a point, for heaven's sakes. At the time I was worth, I won't say exactly, but many, you know, seven figures. But yet I went back to McDonald's and did this just to prove a point. So if I can do it, Leo can do it, for heaven's sakes. Or any of these people that are getting the free money, they can do it. You see? And this is why I have such an issue with this, just giving you an anecdotal kind of story there. But let's continue. All right. And that's the end of the article. So the main takeaways there are, in my opinion, these people who are pushing it are doing it to gain power and control. I think that's what Benioff's game plan is. I think that's what the World Economic Forum, that's why they're pushing it. I think that's why he bought Time magazine in the first place. For the useful idiots like Miss Soon Seong, I believe her name was, in my opinion, they just feel guilty because they're consuming so much more than they produce. And this allows them to feel better about themselves. It allows them to sleep at night. Uh, so, regardless of whether or not what they're doing is effective or even counterproductive, they will continue to do it because it's the only thing that makes them feel bad or feel good. And they'll continue to rationalize it, regardless of whether we present them, or Thomas Sowell, more specifically, presents them with all of the facts and the data in the world from various countries showing that this doesn't work. And in fact, it has the opposite effect. And then finally, the probability of UBI is just going up by the day. This is something that you have to give a 70-80% chance of coming to fruition within the next, call it 3 or 5 years, something like that. I just don't think there's an argument where it could be less than a 70% probability. And when they do this, it might work for the first couple years. People will think that they've found the goose that lays the golden egg, but this is going to ignite a round of inflation that vastly exceeds what we saw in 2020 and in 2021. We're just getting ready to do another story, Josh and I, today about Chevrolet or GM, excuse me. And I want to give a hat tip to my good buddy Peter Schiff, who was talking about this on his podcast. And I believe I heard Jim Bianco, who's another friend of mine, talking about this on the Real Vision podcast on Thursday or Friday. But the average cost of a GM car, GM, not BMW, not Mercedes, not Porsche, GM, has gone up to $47,000. 47,000, up like 20 or 25%. So, and then last week we talked about all the shortages. I think I talked about that last night on my live stream. How we're seeing shortages everywhere, and within energy. And I think the more they pursue these policies, the more shortages you are going to see. So even if you're giving people all this free money, we're not going to have enough stuff for everybody. And then you see bread lines, then you see rationing, very similar to what we saw in communist Russia. I think the probability is high that that's what we see in the future here in the United States and in the Western world if we continue down this path towards universal basic income.